Okay, everybody, we're going to get started. I love the conversations that are going on. Lunch is always the best part, but you're in for a treat. There's Chris. So when Chris Castle called us over a year ago and started talking about how Washington, D.C. could be the host for the next symposium, he asked for ideas of kind of, who are the makers and shakers in Washington, D.C. And at the time, I had just met a newcomer to our town that moved across the pond to bring his expertise to Washington. And we're so grateful that he did. The Digital Media Association, you're going to hear about in just a few minutes, is basically comprised of the music DSPs that we all listen to every single day. And they are very, very wise to have hired Graham Davies as their president and CEO, and we feel very fortunate that you're here today. So I'm going to turn it over to Graham. Please welcome him.
Thanks so much, Linda. In terms of the slides, how do I move those on? Is it the big green button? Gotcha. Okay, good afternoon, everyone. And thanks so much for the invitation to speak today and participate with such illustrious company. As Linda said, so I'm Graham Davies. I'm President and CEO of DEMA, the Digital Media Association. And I've just completed my first year based here in Washington, D.C. And as Linda says, I think that, there we go, the slide is working. Awesome. We're playing an important role representing the interests of the global music streaming services. You can see our members there, Amazon, Apple, Feed FM, Pandora, Spotify, and YouTube. So our role is to promote and protect the ability of music fans to engage with creative content whenever and wherever they want, and for artists to more easily reach old fans and make new ones. Linda's I was hoping my accent might convey I'm not from these shores, and as Linda's said, I'm originating from the UK. So a bit of background, much of my career was spent in music publishing, initially at ARS for Music, the collective rights management organisation in the UK, representing performing and mechanical rights on behalf of songwriters and publishers. PRS is the equivalent of ASCAP and BMI plus the MLC here in the USA. During my time at PRS, when I should point out the UK was still part of the European Union, yeah, exactly. I worked on significant industry re-engineering required to respond to the European Commission's desire for a competitive pan-European framework for digital music licensing. The Commission understood that it was untenable for streaming services, which at the time had to go to 30-plus places in terms of collecting societies' rights holders based in each territory, to clear the rights required for their pan-European services. Similarly, rights holders understood that it makes no sense for each collecting society in every country to process the same usage reports containing trillions of lines of data and maintain databases containing millions of works information. The new system that we designed and implemented needed to deliver value for both sides, for licensees and for rights holders. I mention this because it will be an important theme running through my remarks today, the need for an efficient, effective, workable system for all parties. Following PRS, I continued to work in the collecting society world before becoming CEO of the IVAS Academy, the UK trade association representing the interests of songwriters and composers. I spent 5 years as an advocate for songwriters, a period that included the pandemic, when they became much more reliant on their streaming revenues, and as the live industry had come to a stop. As an aside, I should point out that just prior to my taking the role at the Academy, I attended a presentation by David Lowery to the Academy's members on the challenges of licensing mechanical rights in the USA and the actions he had taken in response to this. So it feels somewhat full circle for me to be here today speaking on similar themes at a conference David helped found. David's lecture was pre-pandemic, But when it hit, creators turned their attention to questioning whether enough of the streaming royalties paid into the industry by streaming services were making their way to them. I led the campaign that brought about the UK's parliamentary inquiry into the economics of streaming, a once-in-a-generational review of the music industry. And again, our very own Chris Castle, another founder of the Symposium, contributed evidence himself to the inquiry. So I feel I'm on common ground here in providing some further detail on it now, given my close involvement and its continued relevance to today's symposium. So as a bit of background, the inquiry was led by the UK's Parliament Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and it took place between October 2020 and September 2021. Although the UK government continue a role in monitoring this subject afterwards. The committee began their inquiry thinking it needed to bring the heads of the leading music streaming services before them to ask why artists and songwriters were concerned about streaming and what the streaming services should do about it. The services did indeed take part in the hearings, but so did representatives from across the industry, including heads of labels, publishers, managers, collecting societies, and more. The committee's initial instinct to focus the inquiry on the work of the streaming services was quickly adjusted due to a misconception. They learned that the streaming services do not pay artists and songwriters directly, and this is a common misconception. Streaming services pay around 70% of their revenues they collect from the consumer to music rights holders, that being the labels, publishers, and collecting societies. And it's the labels, the publishers, and the collector societies who pay these royalties to the artists, musicians, producers, and songwriters in the way of contractual agreements, fees, and royalty payments. Educating the committee on how music streaming works was an important component of the inquiry, enabling them to understand where the 70% of revenues paid to the industry went and whether the artists and songwriters were receiving a fair share of these monies. During the inquiry, I gave evidence alongside the General Secretary of the UK's Musicians' Union. We were both asked, as representatives and songwriters and performers, if we believed the streaming services margin of approximately 30% should be reduced as a means of enabling more money to be paid to creators. And we both responded that we did not believe that this would solve the concerns being raised. We both believed then, and I continue to believe now, that streaming services need a reasonable margin to operate, with which to invest and innovate for the continued growth and health of the music industry. Instead, we encourage the inquiry to focus their attention on the transparency and terms of the contracts between artists and songwriters with their labels and publishers, respectively. We also encourage to focus on missing payments that result from absent or incorrect data. As the inquiry progressed, the UK government commissioned research on creators' earnings in the digital age. The UK's Competition and Markets Authority undertook a market study, and research was commissioned by the Intellectual Property Office into the impact of recommendation algorithms, remuneration, and contract adjustment mechanisms. While such a comprehensive investigation of music streaming wasn't necessarily what we thought was going to result from us campaigning for it, it is what happened. And so I'd like to highlight a few conclusions they made. So firstly, streaming has had a profound impact on the recorded music industry, making it easier for artists to record music and distribute it online, which has transformed how creators earn their income. The CMA found that between 2014 and 2020, the number of artists releasing music in the UK had doubled, from 200,000 to 400,000. Revenues from streaming had continued to grow, and this growth from streaming had been central to the industry's recovery. They found that competition between streaming services was delivering positive outcomes for consumers who had access to a far wider range of music than ever before. They noted that royalty rates in major deals with artists had increased steadily from 19.7% in 2012 to 23.3% in 2021. And songwriters and publishers, the value of their rights had also increased significantly from 8% of revenue in 2008 to 15% in 2021. And they found there remained a broader policy debate about the optimal distribution of these existing revenues in the industry. I draw your attention to this work because I think it provides context to my remarks today. While there are differences in law structures and approaches in different territories, many of the underlying issues and questions are the same. But before getting into these issues in more detail, I would like to provide an update on the increasing value and importance of streaming that it has for artists, songwriters, fans, the music industry, and national economies. The global value of music copyright is increasing, estimated to be 41.5 billion in 2022, and that's up over 10 billion from 2 years prior. And of the recorded music revenues component, 67% is generated by streaming. And this is even higher in the US, where a whopping 84% of total recorded music revenues are generated by streaming. This compares with physical product, once the top revenue source, which now only equates to around 18%. And for the younger members of the audience, I should point out that this was not always the case. In 1999, the 50-year era of vinyl, CD, and physical product dominance began to fall with the arrival of Napster and peer-to-peer file sharing, which enabled the consumer to illegally access music for free. The music industry took a major hit as piracy decimated the industry's revenues. There are questions about whether or how, at the time, people would pay for music again. So it was an important moment when the legal services arrived with iTunes launched in 2003, YouTube 2005, and Spotify 2008 in the US. In just 20 years, DEMA's members have created a thriving, compelling user experience where legal access to music has made the devastating impact of piracy a thing of the past. And the IFPI, the record label's global body, says that the growth they saw in 2023 was the 9th consecutive year of increases, estimating 1 trillion streams and 700 million subscribers globally last year. This success story is strong for music publishing, which, as I previously remarked, has seen a very significant growth in the share of revenues. According to Goldman Sachs, and thanks to them, a lot of my presentation is based on their reports here, music publishing is thought to make 2 times the value today than it ever did from physical product. There we go. And if we look at the reports from CSAC, the global body representing collecting societies, over the last 5 years, 87% of the growth in their collections has been driven by digital. The global value of music copyrights is estimated to continue growing now at around 7% a year over the next 5 years. And some are estimating that streaming will help power recorded music revenues to 100 billion by 2031. And all of this, of course, comes on the projected increasing penetration of streaming in various markets around the world. And the circa 9% growth in paid streaming revenues over the next 5 years will be driven by emerging markets by a factor of 2 to 1 over developed markets. And we can see that Latin America, Asia, and Africa are leading that charge. And there's been a strong trend of increasing volumes of content linked to the earlier message that we saw in the UK, that there's been a substantial increase in the number of artists. And here we see a plus 18% trend over the last 5 years of the number of tracks uploaded to music streaming services. And with increasing numbers of artists and increasing volume of tracks, we also see the sharp concentration in the number of people who have uploaded more than 10 songs and have at least 10,000 monthly listeners on Spotify. And while the rates of growth in value may be slowing due to penetration in Western markets, streaming remains the primary engine of global growth for the music industry over the coming years. And this growth has created a new and highly lucrative market for the sale of future royalties as an asset, In fact, according to Musonomics, streaming contributed around 60% to the value of those music transactions in 2021. But providing access to great music is central to this story. So too is maintaining a satisfied consumer who's willing to pay for access to music each month. A recent consumer survey we undertook in Canada showed that 86% of respondents say they were either satisfied or very satisfied with their streaming service. And sustaining this consumer satisfaction is a challenge. There are competing pressures from multiple angles, from rights holders who understandably seek to increase the return on the revenue of their rights, but also pressures from governments in some countries who seek to put new costs and burdens on services, to the ever-increasing volume of music available on services and the costs and complexity of licensing. DEMA does not comment on pricing or engage in pricing, but we can observe that over the past couple of years, there have been several increases to pricing across different services. So that is some hopeful, useful backdrop to when we're talking about music streaming, what are we talking about, and what is its importance and value, and the success that it has had. There are many reasons to be enthusiastic about this, but of course there are issues and challenges that we face as an industry. Some of these tensions are long-standing, relating to the industry practices and structures, while others have arisen as the changes from streaming have been brought about. I'd need a lot longer to do justice to any of these today, but would like to summarize the ones that I think are hopefully of relevance. So firstly, streaming has given access for artists to a global audience. The barriers to entry that existed in the physical age, which were included limited shelf space, geographic and cultural restrictions, and reliance on label deals to break through, have been significantly reduced. But streaming services give artists the opportunity to build a fan base around the world and provide the consumer with access to the global repertoire. These reductions in barriers to entry have tremendous benefits for releasing the potential, autonomy, and diversity of artists. But it has also resulted in the challenge I mentioned before of artists now having to compete with the increased availability of music. DEMA's members respond to this challenge by investing significantly in supporting and educating artists and songwriters how to make full use of the services to promote their music effectively. Next, streaming has enabled consumer-led discovery. Discovery is fundamental to streaming's product offering and the consumer satisfaction. Streaming is the number one source of discovery and rediscovery of music. With streaming, the music fan has the option to select playlists and lean back or lean into their service, choosing the music they like and receiving recommendations for what they could listen to next. Both methods lead to discovery of more music. Streaming has then challenged the traditional broadcast models based on curation of a relatively small, finite number of tracks selected with a limited number of rotation slots. Now the consumer is the arbiter of the music they listen to and the exploration journey they undertake. Gone is the old model favored by some national regulators that seeks to limit what a society should listen to based on national boundaries. In numerous countries around the world, DEMA's members invest significantly in local teams working alongside local talent to promote diversity of genres, local artists, and indigenous music. This empowers music that is local to the place of the listener alongside music from around the world. And streaming has, significantly increased speed to market. The time taken to release a new recording has been reduced significantly. This has a lot of benefits, but it's not come without problems, including the lack of full inclusion of the important information on the performers, producers, and songwriters involved in the track. The liner notes, as we used to call them on physical product, were greatly valued by consumers and all of those creators alike. The information is important for those creators' business development, as well as discovery for consumers. Today, many works are delivered to DEMA's members in the way of recordings without this full data, and we are active working with the industry to tackle the issue of missing credits and inaccurate data, a topic I'll come back to shortly. And streaming, like any form of distribution, can be abused by bad actors. Unfortunately, piracy, manipulation, and fraud have always been a feature of the music industry. The challenge exists today, and DEMA's members work diligently alongside others to combat it. And streaming has also raised questions about the best models for royalty distribution, how revenues should be pooled and distributed, whether pro rata, user-centric, artist-centric, or some other method, is a live discussion in the industry today. Our objective should be to foster as strong a creator-fan connection as possible, but we must also keep in mind that any proposals for change are for the industry as a whole and not solely for the streaming services. Any presentation today is going to have to mention AI. It should mention AI. And, you know, because the whole industry is grappling, trying to understand what it means for the future. We know, as we've heard today, it will be a powerful tool for creation and efficiency, and we also know we must tackle unauthorized digital replicas. I gave evidence earlier this year to the Senate Judiciary IP Committee on the No Fakes Act, where I made clear that we see the need for new and appropriate protections in this area. DEMA's members have nothing to gain from distributing harmful content, and we continue to work constructively with industry colleagues and policymakers to develop workable and appropriate federal legislation and safeguards. Could I get some water? Someone is. Thank you so much. The need, the need for modernisation of music licensing and operations, and this last issue I'd point to is this is a continuing need for modernisation of the industry, which has at times been slow to keep pace with the innovation that our members have led. Obtaining the required licenses in an efficient and timely way remains a key area for improvement for our members, and one that I will return to shortly when I discuss the Music Modernisation Act. But before doing that, I would like to address the question central to the UK debate and often cited by artists: where do the streaming dollars go? So as you've heard from me just now, streaming is generating billions of dollars for the music industry, and more are making money from music today than at any point before. It can be hard then to square these facts with statements and questions from creators who feel they're not making enough. The bumper sticker descriptions of music industry economics are often what make the headlines, but rarely, if ever, tell the full story. An example of a bumper sticker moment happened about this time last year, when Weird Al Yankovic made industry headlines when he said that he had had over 80 million streams on one streaming service and estimated he had earned $12 from these streams. He said he had, quote, enough to get myself a nice sandwich at a restaurant. A catchy headline. But as one trade news outlet pointed out, based on their calculations, 80 million streams on this particular service would have actually generated around $300,000 in sound recording royalties, nearly $48,000 in mechanical royalties, and $41,000 in performance royalties. So the total may have been more likely $386,000. If Al had received all of these royalties, he could have eaten his nice sandwich at a restaurant every day for the next 88 years. For the sake of argument today, let's assume Weird Al's music was this popular and generated these streams. The question then becomes, where did the streaming dollars go? Or to put it another way, who ate all of Al Yankovic's sandwiches? As I mentioned, we remember that streaming services do not pay artists like Al directly. It's not plausible for them to do so. It adds tremendous amount of inefficiency and complexity to an already complex system. Indeed, as an aside, we should note radio, for instance, doesn't pay songwriters and artists directly either. So while DEMA's members are concerned when artists such as Al Yankovic complain about the lack of royalties they see from streaming of their music, It is problematic when this is directed at the streaming services as the cause of the issue. Services do not have control or visibility into the label and publisher agreements with artists and songwriters, respectively. Those are individual agreements that have different terms, advances, recoupment rates, and otherwise. Streaming services also have no insight into how collecting societies process and distribute the royalties to their members, nor whether the data on the recordings being made is accurate or complete. These issues are less headline-grabbing than the sandwich reference, but are meaningful context when trying to understand some of the likely causes for the difference between what a creator may expect and what they receive. And we have to recognize that the models of music creation and consumption continue to change. It used to be that when someone bought a CD, every writer on that CD would get a cut of the royalties, whereas today, people might stream only one song from an album, and only writers on that song being streamed are generating royalties. And in the CD era, that royalty generally came only once with the sales. But with streaming, there's a continuous generation of royalties. And as I've mentioned, the number of songwriters involved in creating a song can be high, diluting the share of royalty a songwriter receives. And we're aware of songwriter advocates raising concerns that artists and producers can further dilute this by receiving publishing credits. And this leads them to then ask, should they have the same treatment, being given recording credits and royalties? Beyond these considerations, there are ongoing issues with data in the music industry, and we cannot discuss where the money goes without looking at how to better ensure that all the money in the system is going to the right place. Missing, incomplete, and inaccurate metadata can have a significant impact on getting credit and getting paid. This is an issue close to my heart. I'd spent many years trying to deal with solutions to reduce the significant cost that collecting societies have trying to track down this data. It's why I formed the Credits Due initiative when I was at the IVAs, to raise awareness of the problem and support industry-wide solutions, to get the metadata to be attached to recordings at the earliest point in the creative process. This was actually how I first encountered DEMA, who have supported this initiative from the beginning. The supply of recordings with accurate metadata is in the interest of creators, rights holders, and streaming services alike. So we can see then there are many reasons why Al may not have received the royalties he had hoped he would from streaming revenues paid into the music industry. These are challenges we all must work on together. But how we do this, and the sums paid by streaming services to rights holders, how do they compare to the sums paid in other forms of exploitation? Take radio as a comparison. Our data for work we're doing in Canada, for example, shows that a commercial radio station is paying between 8 and 9% of their revenues in royalty payments. I say this not to disparage broadcasters, they have a different business model. But I think it is important to level set on the fact that streaming is paying the music industry a significantly higher proportion of revenues than traditional distribution models. And what do streaming services do with the margin they retain? Our members use this for continuous innovation to provide the most compelling consumer experiences on which the industry, as we can see, now depends. They invest in marketing to attract and retain the listeners. They support creators and cultural institutions through projects and industry initiatives. And this margin pays for the cost of ingesting and managing millions of recordings and the cost of navigating the complex business of licensing rights to the worldwide repertoire. And in this area, by way of context, streaming services must clear the largest number of rights compared to any other distribution model. Put simply, any business needs to make a margin to keep the lights on and to support ongoing investments. Having demonstrated how much value for the industry is now dependent on streaming, it is important that their streaming services continue to operate with the appropriate margin. And so again, to return to where do the streaming dollars go, I think hopefully I've helped bring to light that the answer is complicated. There is no single one answer, no silver bullet, and no easy sandwich analogy. There are layers and complexities that are important to acknowledge, because without doing so, it actually makes it harder to make progress. And this brings me to the Music Modernisation Act, because I think it's a prime example of a time when the industry did come together to make licensing more efficient and improve the system for all stakeholders. By way of background, the MMA was signed into law in 2018, and in legislative terms, this is still a brand new law. And from what we've seen so far, it's working. And for clarity, for my colleagues in the room who want me to clarify, here we go. When I say MMA, I'm talking about Title I of the bill. The MMA had multiple titles, which addressed several issues. But the entire MMA was focused on making licensing work better. Okay, we're all on the right page. So before the Music Modernisation Act, the mechanical licensing system was broken. It was broken for songwriters, it was broken for music publishers, and it was broken for streaming services. And to be clear, all participants were victims of the old status quo. The issue wasn't services refusing to or seeking to avoid obtaining the licenses they needed to operate. This myth can be quickly dispelled by looking at the deals that were in place with the record labels, covering tens of millions of sound recordings being made available. No, there was no effective way for music publishers to license streaming services at the scale required. The previous approach to licensing musical compositions was not particularly effective before and became entirely unfit when it was overtaken by the speed of adoption of streaming. And to understand why this is the case, let's step through how the licensing process worked, or more accurately, how it didn't work pre-MMA. In every piece of recorded music, there are two rights, one for the recording itself and one for the composition or the song. Labels license the recording, and while it could be cumbersome at times, the licensing process has always worked. It worked before and it works now. There is rarely much ambiguity over who owns the sound recording, and so the licensing process is relatively simple. The failures in the pre-MMA system appeared on the composition side of the equation, the licensing of the song. Firstly, when the licensing of the rights in the composition, streaming services must pay two separate rights, the performing right and the mechanical right. This is even when they are almost always, if not always, owned by the same rights owners. The services must pay performing rights organisations for the performing right, and in general, the publishers for the mechanical right. Second, the composition rights are typically split among several rights owners. As I mentioned before, there can be any number of writers, but on average, every song has about 3. As a matter of industry practice, publishers generally only license their share of the composition, meaning to clear rights in the whole song, a licensee must go to multiple and sometimes a dozen or more rights holders. Third, rights holders often don't know what they own and are not able to do the type of high-volume licensing that is required in the streaming age. It's common for there to be delays between the writing of a song and each writer notifying their individual publishers of its existence and what their share of the work is. There could be timing delays for each of the publishers to notify their interest, and it can be common for there to be disagreements over the shares of the song being claimed. And the vast inconsistencies and missing data can be compounded by frequent sale of publishing catalogues from one publisher to another. In the pre-MMA days, both digital services and music publishers did the best they could, relying on existing mechanical licensing agents, direct licenses, and eventually a cumbersome but available method for providing bulk notices to the US Copyright Office. This system arose from the work-by-work clearing, which had taken place previously of maybe a dozen tracks for a physical album release, which was manageable but found to be completely unworkable for the scale of recordings being ingested onto the digital services. The whole industry recognized the importance of streaming and the need for its growth, and that this system was not working. When looking to propose a solution, why not turn to the model established by Sound Exchange, led by, I believe, this business school's very own John Simpson. There we go, shout out. Where Congress would create a single blanket license to cover all works and a single administrator to collect and distribute the royalties. There's the pink blob. That's the big difference there. You see that? Just checking you were paying attention. So when the MMA was passed, it created a new blanket license to be administered by a new single entity called the Mechanical Licensing Collective. These are the fundamental components, indeed the underpinning of what the MMA is for streaming. Uniquely, under this, services agreed that the reasonable costs of the new MLC should be funded entirely by them. This means that 100% of the royalties paid by streaming services flow through the MLC to rights holders, with none of the costs of operation of the MLC reducing these royalty payments. Most mechanical collecting societies around the world deduct their costs from the revenues received, which reduces the remaining royalties available for distribution. I don't know if the MLC is unique in this regard, but I think it is. Oh, no, that's not worked. I need to go back. There we go. Thanks. To date, DEMA's members and other streaming services have paid more than $160 million for the operation of the MLC, including meeting all of the requirements for its setup. And the MLC has now distributed more than $2 billion in revenue collected from the streaming services. The flow of these royalties, then, is a great success. The MMA has given us certainty to licensees, certainty to rights holders alike, whether major publishers, independent publishers and songwriters, as well as large and small streaming models. With the investment provided by the services, the MLC has formed in record time, meeting tight statutory deadlines, even in the face of the global pandemic. And I take the opportunity to recognise the remarkable progress that's been made in just 4 years and the dedication of those working at the MLC to achieve this. I say this on the basis of I have the privilege of being a non-voting member of the board of the MLC, sitting alongside the voting board members who serve as inferior officers of the United States government, compelled to act as representatives of a statutory system, not of a particular constituency. It's our collective role to ensure the MLC embraces its responsibility. It's actually a statutory obligation to serve its 3 key stakeholders, those being songwriters, publishers, and streaming services. Getting the balance right is hard, and there will be times when the MLC will need to take actions against the DSPs, just as there will be times they will take actions potentially adverse to publishers or songwriters alike. Their fidelity must be to the system. And a reminder of the MLC's obligations was made possible this year with the periodic review of its designation, a requirement under the law. And DEMA, along with our community, provided many comments to help support the redesignation of the MLC, which we endorsed. But along with other industry players, we've given thoughts in terms of what the continuous improvement of the MLC could look like. And governance and oversight were key topics for us, and we look forward to the US Copyright Office's deliberations on these matters. We believe the MMA was a great step in the right direction, and that the blanket license and the MLC have been a great success. While it is logical for there to be areas of improvement for the MLC, given we are only 6 years from the bill being signed into law, the MMA should be supported, not undermined. Now is not the time for attempts to unravel it. I cannot be clearer that any efforts to unravel the MMA will not improve licensing or improve the growth and success of the music industry. Rather, such moves will lead to an upheaval of the whole system and likely return to the problems of the past. And finally, as we talk about licensing efficiency and how the clear flow of royalties to the proper copyright owners, one question often brought up is whether it's fair to have a government agency setting rates. The fact is, there is no ideal solution to the challenge of how best to set rates for a blanket statutory license. Congress has tried all kinds of solutions, and while no system is perfect, the Copyright Royalty Board, formed in 2004 as a permanent part of the Library of Congress, does an admirable job. It's important to remember that parties can and do settle proceedings, which we believe is what Congress intended to happen. And to address a possible elephant in the room, a system that is designed to work in the interest of the whole industry should not be upturned because one stakeholder is unhappy about a commercial dispute. Commercial disputes are resolved as contracts and are not unusual at all. They are a normal part of business. They're not a reason to throw out the entire system, especially one that is only a few years old and is demonstrably better than what existed before. In fact, I'll say again, the current system delivered a settlement of the rates. The very fact that the parties reached a settlement is a sign that the MMA is working as intended, creating an environment ripe for cooperation. And cooperation remains our focus for improving the system for all stakeholders. We hope to build on advances we have made and avoid attempts to put the industry into reverse, making it less clear, less efficient, less effective for all stakeholders. So in conclusion, I hope to have provided a useful perspective on streaming as it relates to the Symposium's objective, as I understand it, of exploring artist and creator autonomy amid a drastically changing entertainment and music industry. Streaming is delivering enormous gains, but of course these sit alongside these long-standing as well as newer issues. I hope to have provided further insight into the role of streaming services and the complexity around questions of artist remuneration. Dialogue will be key to finding balanced solutions, and strong dialogue between streaming services and the artistic community was something that I made a feature of in my work as CEO of the Ivors Academy, and it remains an important feature of my work now as CEO of DEMA. There we go. So my thanks to David and Chris and the Artists' Rights Institute, to Linda, John, and the American University for the opportunity to speak to you today. Thank you. I think I've got time for the odd question. It's also fine for there to not be any questions.
Hi, I had a question. What was the name of? I'm right here. Sorry. What was the name of your company? You said that it was it related to making sure that was it the metadata, or was it more so the splits? Or go ahead.
Was it Credits Due?
Yeah, credits due. There we go.
Yeah.
If you could just elaborate more on that.
Of course, very happy to. Yeah. So I think at the time, as I say, of launching Credits Due, we were in this moment of a really important conversation about streaming royalties, but to be honest, it became a much bigger conversation about how the music industry was operating generally, and the gap in terms of this metadata. I mean, my observation is, having worked at MTPS, the equivalent of the MLC in the UK, which would be the body which would issue the licenses for a physical product to go to market. And that was a point where all of the information for the artwork and the liner notes and who are the songwriters and all of that information came together. I'm not sure it was necessarily easy pulling it all together, but it did happen. But then with digital, that step kind of dropped away. I'm not saying rightly or wrongly. You know, the pace of release of music is now much greater. So actually this problem of the missing metadata, the missing credits, was there already before this conversation that we had, that's sparked by the pandemic and general interest in streaming. So really what we were doing was shining a light on an existing problem, but saying that actually it's a big problem for streaming, and we need to, it's one of the reasons why people don't get paid. You know, the credit is important for an artist, full stop. Everyone should be credited for their work. But it also means that if a payment's going to happen, it either won't happen or it'll happen very late. And working in the collecting society world, where they would get the usage returns, which would give you a recording title, but you don't know what the underlying work is. If that information is not flowing with the recording, It's such a costly, timely effort to try and hunt it down. And all of that needs to be optimized for the sheer volumes of streaming, which means we can't be talking about an individual's name. It needs to be a code. It needs to be an international standard identifier. And these things exist. But again, the issuing of those has also been slow and antiquated. So this is a long-winded way of saying what we wanted to do was to say there needs to be a greater awareness of this issue, but also the issue can only be solved if the whole industry approaches it together, because everyone has a step in the supply chain. And that's kind of the problem. If you start anything that involves multiple people playing a part in a process, unless they're legally compelled to do so, is problematic. And actually representing songwriters at that time, there was a big sort of action, a call to action to songwriters to be educated and step up. Because if songwriters were not actually knowing that they needed to be the first step in this process in terms of actually inputting the information and being enabled to do it as well, then actually it's going to be harder for other people again to go back, or the publisher going back and say, did you write this work, and when and with whom, and what's your share on it? And so Credit Suite was deliberately and a sort of a broad initiative to say, let's update the industry, let's get everyone more oriented to finding solutions. It's not a company, it's an initiative. Anyone can join it. We've got some educational materials that go alongside it. But there's also many other initiatives in the industry sort of tackling this problem. And actually, I'm quite positive that since we launched it, there have been some really positive gains. Some of these international standards can now be issued in a provisional way much quicker, for instance. There is a working group in the UK across the industry that's coming with proposals for improving that supply chain. So there's still a lot more to be done. There's a lot of data that's missing still, but there is progress.
Hi, Graham. My name is Steve, and thanks for the presentation. That was very good. What is DEMA's position or role in such a hot topic as, especially this week, as the bundle, right? The audiobook bundle. You have one member, Spotify, that is claiming to reduce the royalties based on the bundle rate that you just displayed. And I presume Amazon Music is a member, and they have now said just the opposite. Does DEMA, I know you're representing many different services, but does DEMA have a role or position in this issue, which is very significant to artists?
I think you were sort of hedging towards, what I'm about to say, which is what I'm not going to say. So you're right. DEMA has Amazon, Spotify, as well as Apple, YouTube, and others in Pandora, for instance, in our coalition. And DEMA does play a role in terms of that settlement that I talked about. DEMA had a role in that process. As for what is actually, in relation to Spotify, that's a litigation, you will understand I can't comment on it. Yeah. Oh, you don't understand. Okay. Well, I'll educate you. I can't comment on it.
I'm Shayna. I'm a tech builder building in this problem space. A great presentation, new data I hadn't seen before. You mentioned that speeding up licensing is a big problem. Is there anything being built or worked on in regards to that with DEMA?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think, the processes for us, there are some sort of really big sort of places that the services go to get the licenses, and some of that, as I kind of say, works really well. But where you get proliferation of rights holders, I think, as I kind of explained, the services need to be made whole, as it were. You know, our members are, I would absolutely, you know, you'd expect me to say they're really good actors. They're completely wanting to clear the licenses, pay for those licenses. And I think that the challenge we do see is you know, we've got mechanical licenses that are operating under one kind of system, and then performing rights are happening in a different way, and then we have the labels as well. Bringing all of that together into a cohesive timescale that is reasonable, as well as adds up, as it were, is probably our key focus at the moment. And I'm not sure whether there's necessarily a technological solution to that. I think getting the right sort of this data issue, as I talked about, so actually all of the rights are identified. I mean, we would encourage lots of technology to help fill that problem space, but I think the industry structures are more involved in terms of how we actually get the licensing system, you know, operating more effectively.
Thanks, Graham. Okay, we're going to take about a 10-minute break and convene back here by 1:45 for the next panel on metadata.